Jason Rodacher, Dean for First Year Experience at Washington Lee University. We're here welcoming the class of 2023. We're glad you're here.
Hi, I'm Madison Sumatra and I'm from Nashville, Tennessee.
Addison Tripp Mulligan, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Elizabeth Edwards from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hi, I'm Andrew Martinelli, I'm from New York.
Lauren Hayes, and I'm from Houston, Texas.
I'm Ben Hess, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I really like WNL's commitment to letting their students study what they feel passionate about. There's a great commitment to academic diversity I think is really special. That really brings a sense of community that I really like.
I'm Grace, I'm from Utah.
And I'm Megan, I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
My name's Carter Chandler, I'm from Montgomery, Alabama.
Sunhee Kim, and I'm from Fort Myers, Florida.
Harry Crutcher from Dallas, Texas.
Avalon Purnell, and I'm from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Well, it has like one of the only accredited journalism programs in like a liberal arts setting, so that was a big factor, and Johnson Scholarship.
My name's Alexander Zeringer, and I'm from New York City, New York.
Hi, I'm Beckett Waters. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina.
Sophia Hall, I'm from Houston, Texas.
I'm Carolyn Todd from Cumberland, Maine.
I'm Avi. I'm from Wisconsin. Yeah, I've heard so much about the alumni. Actually, on my first day here, I met a couple of alumni who were just walking down the hall, and they gave me their business cards, and we started talking about stuff, and it was super cool.
Hi, I'm Eloisa Petter, and I'm from Colorado.
I'm Vivek, I'm from India.
Hi, I'm Marta Mikos, and I'm from Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Dario from Italy.
I'm Emily Brookfield, and I'm from Lexington, Kentucky.
My name is Eric Gazen. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland.
My name is Catherine Shaw, and I'm from Gilbert, Arizona. The smaller liberal arts college is something I was looking for, especially since I am hard of hearing. The smaller classroom sizes I think would help benefit me. I like having more of a personal connection with all of my teachers, and I just really like the small town vibe.
Cecily Stern, I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia.
My name's Harry Barringer. I'm from Greenwich, Connecticut.
Taylor Tucker from Richmond, Virginia.
Gabriel Perry, Indianapolis, Indiana.
Claire Hotze from Houston, Texas. When I was on the tour and we were just walking around, I felt like a student. I felt like I was at home already.
My name's Diana Sturdy, and I'm from Massachusetts.
Shaq, I'm from Silver Spring, Maryland.
My name's Amber Morrison, and I'm from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
My name's Timmy Jones, and I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina.
I'm Kara Flannery, and I'm from West Virginia.
My name is Fatu Lemon, and I'm from New York City. I am a Questbridge Scholar Match, so I rank Washington Lee as one of my schools because it wasn't so far away. So then when I did get matched to Washington Lee, I did do the research and I did fall in love with the school, especially when I came in for dive and I had a first-hand experience on the campus and the people.
Jack Mitchell, Houston, Texas.
Jacob McCabe, Houston, Texas.
Hi, I'm Zhang. I'm from Vietnam.
Hi, I'm Jaya from China.
Hi, I'm Lauren from California.
And I'm Alicia, also from Vietnam.
Dylan Walmsley from Charlottesville, Virginia.
Hi, I'm Finn Connor, and I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I chose WNL because it was a really unique community, and the whole concept of the speaking tradition and the honor code, it just seemed like something really special that you couldn't find somewhere else.
Naveed Javid, Reston, Virginia.
Tyler Palisha, Hanover, Virginia.
Oh, my name is Jamal, and I'm from Tanzania.
Hi, I'm Emma Smith, and I'm from Salem, Virginia. I'm Laura, and I'm from Kansas.
Yeah, I'm Jason Gu. I'm from New Jersey. It was actually during Johnson weekend when all the Johnson finalists walked in. You didn't have to say hi to us because we're just prospective students at that point. But what ended up happening was all the current students just talked to you because they were so nice. So
I'm John Coleman Ward. I go by JC, and I'm from South Carolina.
My name's Jillian Gallardo. I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia.
I'm Okolocha Mesoma, and I'm from Nigeria.
Hi, I'm Pierce Robinson from Kings Mountain, North Carolina.
Hi, I'm Madison. I'm from Florida.
Michael Tanzer, I'm from Zimbabwe.
I'm Owen Malcolm, I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
I'm Lily from Colorado.
I'm Meg from Baltimore, Maryland.
I'm excited for spring term. I've heard lots of fun.
I'm Sean Waisley, and I'm from New Jersey.
I'm Tori. I'm from Maryland.
I am Susanna. I'm from Kathmandu, Nepal.
And I am Paris. I'm from Rwanda.
I'm Audrey Dietz, and I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I chose to come here for the outstanding athletics and academics. It was just a really great balance for me, and I thought that I would fit in.
Samantha Van Bell, and I'm from New Jersey.
So my name is Nobel Manaya, and I'm from Ethiopia, Addis Ababa.
My name's Andrew Tartakovsky, and I'm from Columbia, Maryland.
Samuel Bass. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina.
All right, I'm Eli Sampson, and I'm from Houston, Texas. I sat in on a POV 101, which was the interdisciplinary Introduction to Poverty class, and just the way that the students were interacting and the way that the professor was kind of
not negatively probing or trying to entice answers out of the students. And the way that the class was coming to a consensus and the way that the class was discussing very important issues, that was one moment when I was like, wow, like, I don't think you're going to be able to get something like that at any other school.
Hi, I'm Sophie Daniels. I'm from
I like that. Y'all just got quiet right away. Well, good afternoon and welcome. I am so pleased to welcome you to what is the first event of the 5-Star Festival. And what an event this is. It is truly a pleasure to get together to celebrate Professor Barton Meigs. Looking for you. He is, as many of you know, I hope, who are here, the new recipient of the Class of 1960 Professorship of Ethics. I could not be more pleased to commence this festival with such a splendid event. When one looks across the landscape of young historians of the Civil War and of U.S. military history in the country, Professor Meigs quickly emerges as an increasingly widely known, respected, and admired scholar. He received his bachelor's Phi Beta Kappa from the College of Worcester in Ohio and his master's and PhD from the University of Georgia. So although I'm still getting to know many of the faculty in the college, I had the good fortune to meet Professor Meigs early in my time at WNL. And we connected immediately over our shared Georgia past. We also had the opportunity to collaborate on a couple of very important searches last year that brought and are bringing fantastic historians to WNL. In working with Professor Meigs, I quickly discovered that his reputation as a leading historian was not only valuable to our students in the classroom and useful to other scholars in the field, but a critical factor in shaping the instruction of history at WNL. Professor Meigs joined the WNL faculty in 2013. Prior to becoming a professor, he served as a public historian with the National Park Service at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, where he led tours of some of America's most historic battlefields. His main research is on the partisan guerrilla units of both sides of the Civil War conflict, and he is the author and editor of 3 books: The Guerrilla Hunters, Irregular Conflicts During the American Civil War, the prize-winning Executing Daniel Bright, Race, Loyalty, and Guerrilla Violence in a Coastal Carolina Community, and the critically acclaimed Rebels Against the Confederacy, North Carolina's Unionist. He has also published dozens of chapters, articles, op-eds, and reviews. This impressive scholarly productivity is commendable and praiseworthy, and we commend and praise them. But what is notable about Professor Meigs' academic identity is his seamless ability to translate the brilliance of his research to the fecund space of the classroom. Barton is a magnificent teacher. He has been nominated for the State Council of Higher Education of Virginia Rising Star Outstanding Faculty Award, and he is especially well known for his marvelous spring term course that tours the major battlefields of the Civil War. This fall, Professor Meigs will be a featured historian in the new History Channel multi-part documentary on the life of Ulysses S. Grant. Every scholar wants to be on television. You can do it. Indeed, Professor Meigs is an outstanding successor to our previous class of 1960s ethics professors, Lucas Morrell, the politics department, and Sam Calhoun in the law school. He is a deep and careful thinker about military history, the relations between historical event and place, and about the ways in which past historical events continue to hold meaning and significance in the present day. His teaching and research could not be more relevant at our institution at this exact historical moment. We look forward with great anticipation to the nationally known speakers he will bring to campus to interact with our students and faculty. Given the purpose of this professorship, this action is key. The Class of 1960s Ethics Professorship was established by the Class of 1960 as part of their 50th reunion gift to the university. The professorship seeks to support a WNL faculty member in his or her teaching and research, and to support the program established by the Class of 1960 in their 40th reunion gift. This was the Institute for Honor, an ongoing series of programs and initiatives meant to, quote, promote the understanding and practice of honor and honesty as an indispensable element of society. The Institute and the professorship seek to support faculty teaching and research in the areas of ethics, honor, integrity, honesty, and applications of ethical reasoning in addressing contemporary issues. A dedication to ethical and honorable behavior serves as the bedrock of our culture of civility at WNL. Although some would question the continued relevance of such ideas, I'm proud to say that a formative esteem for these values not only endures at WNL, but flourishes at our institution. In accepting the Class of 1960 Ethics Professorship, Professor Meigs realizes this truth in the finest of fashions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Meigs as he prepares to give us his lecture, A Civil War Murder Mystery, The Death and Burial of Lieutenant John Rodgers Meigs. Professor Meigs.
Thank you, Dean Hill, for that really wonderful introduction. That was really touching, actually. Thank you. I deeply appreciate it. I appreciate all of you being here. I appreciate the members of the administration taking time out of what are incredibly busy moments in the fall semester for being here for this brief period that I'm going to give my lecture today. I want to thank my students who are here, who no doubt could be doing other things like reading books for class, including my 300 level sectionalism and secession class. I see a few of you out there, Luke, Danny. All right. I want to thank my colleagues who are here, and it really means a lot to me that you, after a busy day of teaching, and I know you're all tired and want to go home and see your families. Thank you for being here. It means a lot to me. And most importantly, I want to thank my family, my wife, Molly, who's here, who's been here, who helped me for 20 years get to some of my professional goals in my career. And my son, who's not here because Rockbridge County needs one of its best soccer players to be out there with his team this evening at practice. And so that's what I'm missing to give this lecture is Warner's practice. I just want to start briefly with an introductory comment about the professorship and what I believe about it. What makes WNL, I think, truly unique among the National Liberal Arts Colleges of the United States is that emphasis on the creation of a culture of honesty, integrity, our modern understanding of honor. It's rooted in a student-led honor system, faculty creating a culture of responsibility in the classroom, where academic honesty and integrity and high-quality teaching forces students not just to ask the good first question, but to pose the better follow-up question. The creation of one-to-one teaching in our honors thesis and seminar classes, meetings where students are challenged to do independent new research as a central component of their education under the close guidance of faculty who are nationally and internationally recognized in their own fields. The preservation and scholarly interpretation of our historic sites rooted in the National Historic Landmark designations of Washington and Lee University and its rich cultural resources are also critical to the IFH. Beyond the traditional classroom, this very campus is itself a trust that WNL must take responsibility for in a mature, civil, educational, and accurate manner. These cultural resources are important to all Americans, not just our community, and we need to use these resources to educate about WNL's unique American story. Now, I hope to use the next few brief years in this chair to foster and promote those values and to the best of my ability. And I hope you'll support me in those endeavors as you already have with the endowment of the Class of 1960 Professorship in Ethics. And the lecture I've prepared for you today is part of my ongoing scholarly agenda and work in the Civil War Studies field. And it's called A Civil War Murder Mystery, The Death and Burial of John Rodgers Meigs. So, for a bit, while I was working on this particular piece, I've been working on it for about 2 years, off and on, traveling back and forth to the National Archives and to Arlington. I felt like Magnum P.I. while I was working on this particular piece. If you've ever seen the 1980s series with Tom Selleck, all right, every once in a while I thought I actually had the answer. And I thought I really understood the story, and then all of a sudden I'd stumble upon a new piece of evidence and factor it into the puzzle, and I'd realize, well, actually I was probably wrong at the beginning about what happened that night. And then later on, I think I got closer and closer and closer. And you can see. At the end, you can make your own judgment. We'll see whether or not you think I got the murder mystery right in the assessment at the end. Scouting within Union lines near Harrisonburg, Virginia, 3 Confederate soldiers wore rubber raincoats over their uniforms to shield themselves from the drizzling rain of an autumn evening in the Shenandoah Valley. One of the men, Benjamin Franklin Shaver, a private in the 1st Virginia Cavalry and a local resident of the area, guided the Southern soldiers as they observed the Union Army positions of General Philip Sheridan's command. Then, making its way up the valley, focused on destroying the agricultural lifeline of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The same evening, October 3rd, 1864, John Rodgers Meigs, chief engineer of the Middle Military Division serving under Sheridan, was leading 2 Army orderlies along the Swift Run Gap Road on a similar scouting mission to obtain information about the topography and local landscape when the 2 enemy parties encountered each other. In the confusing moments that followed, there was an exchange of gunfire. And while the accounts differ on the precise sequence of events, one fact remains clear. John Rodgers Meigs, first in the West Point class of 1863, the eldest son of Union Army Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, the logistical wizard that helped win the Union War effort, was killed. As the frightened orderlies scattered to relay the story back at Union headquarters, his body was left in the road. The corpse would not be recovered by Union soldiers until the following morning. When orderlies recounted the story, they reported that they had been waylaid by Confederate bushwhackers. In retaliation for what the general believed was an extra-legal guerrilla bushwhacker assault on unsuspecting troops, blustery Philip Sheridan ordered his trusted and zealous subordinate, Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, born in the same county of Ohio where I grew up, to execute a draconian retaliation against the civilians and property in the region near the killing. Eventually, the order was rescinded, but not before approximately 30 buildings were destroyed and hundreds of refugees, many of them anti-slavery and Unionists, Dunkards, and Mennonites living in the region in and around Dayton, Virginia, were displaced. The area of the valley where the destruction occurred became known as the Burnt District. The high impact of fear among Union soldiers over Confederate guerrillas, a term often used to describe all types of irregular units, authorized and unauthorized, is evident in this sequence of events. By this point in the war, Confederate partisan Ranger units under John Singleton Mosby and John Hans McNeil had successfully harassed Union invading forces in Virginia enough to create both animosity and fear about surprise death at the hands of Confederate irregulars, death that might spring from behind any bush, tree, or rocky outcropping. The difficulty of identifying the precise circumstances of the Meigs killing also demonstrates the personal impact of one family, but also the loss of a nation who mourned the sudden death of a rising star among the Union Army's officer corps. Ultimately, his father's decision to bury his son in the former rose garden of the Custis Lee family plantation at Arlington in Northern Virginia was a punitive act of retaliation, as well as one of mourning on the personal level and on the national stage. Labeling John Rodgers Meigs' death an act of murder, his father, Montgomery, called him a martyr in the cause of liberty. A few days after his death on October 7th, his mother wrote in John Rodgers Meigs' diary, and I held the diary in my hand up at the Library of Congress, she wrote the final passage in the diary. She says, "What was brought home this day, the sacred remains of my noble, precious son." The following day, his parents held a funeral at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown, attended by President Abraham Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Secretary of State William H. Seward, and General Henry Wager Halleck. The Meigs lost their firstborn son, and the Union a noble boy, gallant, generous, gifted. The depth of the family's despair was palpable. Editors reported the story and events of the young Lieutenant Meigs' death widely in the northern and southern states. His prominence as first in the West Point graduating class in 1863 and the son of one of the Union Army's highest-ranking officers captured the public's attention. His examination at the academy was brilliant beyond competition. We never knew a more promising young man. He came here to enter upon his military life, stopped a few days in the city, and after having acquired all that was possible for him to learn by inquiry touching the country, reported for duty, described the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer in an obituary published October 8, 1864. His whole soul was in the war. He loved his country and her service, and had the highest appreciation of all that was becoming a soldier. The Army and the country have sustained a great loss in his death, not so much for what he has done, but for what he might have done. Honor to his memory. The editor of the newspaper who Meigs, prior to his death, had published several articles by the precocious engineer on West Virginia campaign activities. He knew him personally. Early reports of John Rodgers Meigs' death outraged the Union officer corps. Meigs was shot under the right eye and in the left breast. He died almost immediately there was no chance for a last goodbye or a good death surrounded by those who cared for him, his family. He was snatched away by death suddenly, abruptly. That was terrifying. It was difficult to reconcile for his friends. The Chief of Staff of the Army of the Shenandoah, James W. Forsyth, reported on October 4th, 1864, that Meigs was killed by guerrillas about 8 p.m. yesterday between Bridgewater and Harrisonburg. His body has just been found and will be forwarded today to Martinsburg. Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah faced considerable resistance from self-constituted guerrilla bands during the course of the 1864 Valley Campaign. Governor John Letcher of Virginia encouraged a general use of guerrilla warfare in the Valley by the citizens when regular Confederate Army resistance waned. Sanctioned partisan rangers under John Hans McNeil and John Singleton Mosby, active in Virginia, were frequently interpreted as bushwhackers and unlawful guerrillas by the Union Army because of the partisans' use of concealment, ambush, hit-and-run tactics against their more numerous foe. Now, in theory, the method of guerrilla warfare could be adopted by anyone among the Confederate populace, making discernment in the field difficult. The recognition of both lawful and unlawful categories for its use, while recognized officially under Francis Lieber's Code in 1863 and issued as Union Army General Orders No. 100 to the Union armies, was not always deployed with legal exactitude by Union officers facing units like Mosby's. And though Mosby was a sanctioned partisan ranger, a protected legal category, he was frequently referred to as a commander of guerrillas, Mosby's guerrillas, in Union Army Valley correspondence. And since they believed he was the only organized opposition in the Valley in early October 1864, it created conditions for Meigs' death to be interpreted as murder by bushwhackers. Now, Union Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had given wide latitude to Union Army commanders in the Valley to deal with the quote-unquote guerrilla problem. In a letter on October 6th, Stanton communicated to Brigadier General William H. Seward, Jr., commanding at Martinsburg, Virginia, that he suggested that after providing suitable guards, any surplus force that you may have should be used in rooting out and destroying any gangs of guerrillas or robbers that may infest your vicinity. Stanton believed that it may be possible that after you have become sufficiently acquainted with the personnel of your command, you can organize a small but efficient corps that may accomplish much in destroying the robbers and murderers that make it a business to plunder our trains and transportation and kill our soldiers in ambush. Perhaps most startling, however, was the Secretary of War Stanton's final admonishment. If you can do so, you are at liberty to employ any means that may be within your power to accomplish that object. And when persons guilty of such transactions come within your power, you may deal with them as their crimes merit, without making any report upon the subject. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Major General Philip Sheridan, Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer, who knew something about bad behavior in the cavalry arm himself. Secretary of War Stanton was clearly aware of the problem of the guerrilla parties disrupting supply and communication lines around Sheridan's force, yet the Meigs' death struck very close to home within Army family circles of the Union High Command, and he recognized this in his correspondence. Stanton wrote his own description, seemingly to come to grips with the event of what had happened on the night of John Rodgers Meigs' death. In the death of this gallant young officer, the department has occasion to deplore no ordinary loss. Last year, he graduated the military academy at West Point with highest honors. At the head of his class, was commissioned as a lieutenant of engineers and immediately sent to the field. Stanton lamented. He performed meritorious and distinguished services during the campaigns of the last year on the fortifications at Baltimore and Harper's Ferry and at Cumberland. In every position, he gave proof of great professional skill, personal courage, and devoted patriotism. One of the youngest and brightest of the military profession, he has fallen an early victim to murderous rebel warfare. Stanton's use of the word murder and his belief that the talented Meigs had been gunned down by bushwhackers in cold blood drove his anger. Clearly, Meigs was no ordinary loss to the Union military senior leadership. Philip Sheridan, his October 7th report of the incident to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, detailed his punitive operations. I have destroyed over 2,000 barns filled with wheat and hay and farming implements, over 7 mills filled with flour and wheat, have driven in from the army over 400 herd of stock, and killed not less than 30,000 sheep. That's a lot of sheep. I actually double-checked the source on that just to make sure. I was like, 30,000 sheep, that's a lot of sheep. Now, Lieutenant John Rodgers Meigs of the New York Engineers was murdered beyond Harrisonburg near Dayton. For this atrocious offense, all the houses within an area of 5 miles were burned. Since I came in from the valley, from Harper's Ferry, every train, every small party, every straggler have been bushwhacked by the people, many of whom have protection papers from commanders who have been hitherto in that valley. Yet Sheridan ended on a triumphal note. Confederate partisan John H. McNeil was mortally wounded and fell in our hands. This was fortunate, as he was the most daring and dangerous of all the bushwhackers in that section of the country. Now, Sheridan's memoirs offer another story. Sheridan's memoirs offer a version of events based upon the relatively vague account of one of the Union orderlies who quickly escaped from the incident. Meigs was murdered within my lines. He had gone out with 2 topographical assistants to plot the country, and late in the evening, while riding along the public road on his return to camp, he overtook 3 men dressed in our uniform. Sheridan remembered. This was not accurate, actually. It's likely that Union soldiers could not see the uniforms of the Confederates because they were under raincoats. Meigs was killed without resistance of any kind, whatever, and without even the chance to give himself up, the general related. Sheridan believed, at least initially, that Meigs did not have a chance to discharge his revolver in the exchange of gunfire. He appeared to have been killed instantly. The fact that the murder has been committed inside our lines, Sheridan wrote, was evidence that the perpetrators of the crime, having their homes in the vicinity, had been clandestinely visiting them and had been secretly harbored by some in the neighborhood, some residents in the neighborhood. Determining to teach a lesson to those abettors of the foul deed, a lesson they would never forget, I ordered all the houses within an area of 5 miles to be burned. Many were burned. But after Sheridan learned his error, that it had been a fair, if confusing, exchange of gunfire, he rescinded the order. George Custer was given the command of the destruction. And according to Sheridan, when a few houses in the immediate neighborhood of the scene of the murder had been burned, Custer was directed to cease his desolating work, but to fetch away all the able-bodied males as prisoners. In short, Sheridan's account in his memoirs makes sense as a defense and a rationalization for his subsequent orders to Custer. Now, you may be wondering, these sketches are actually created by a Frank Leslie's Illustrated sketch artist named J.E. Taylor. And J.E. Taylor was attached to Sheridan's command tent throughout the 1864 Valley Campaign. So he sketched all these moments, but he was also about the closest thing we had to a neutral observer and a neutral investigator after the fact, because he never quite let this moment of Meigs' death go. He went back later on after the war and further investigated what had happened on the night of the incident. And ultimately, it's going to be Taylor that helps us understand exactly what happened, to sort through the various accounts and contradictory accounts they are about what happened that night. Now, the Confederate accounts are very, very interesting on this. This is Benjamin Franklin Shaver. Confederate accounts of the incident provide another dimension to understanding the confusion of John Rodgers Meigs' death. There was also some confusion in the Confederate accounts of the incident, though these accounts are more detailed on the specific events of what happened that night. F.M. Campbell, George W. Martin were scouts from Company H, Black Horse Troop of the 4th Virginia Cavalry, Wickham's Brigade, Fitzhugh Lee's Division, Army of Northern Virginia, and Benjamin Franklin Shaver, a member of Company I, 1st Virginia Cavalry, was a scout who lived in the local area. In the fall of 1865, Martin claimed responsibility for shooting Meigs in a detailed affidavit about the confusing incident. The sun had nearly gone down, and the evening cloudy and rainy. We were wearing oilcloths over our uniforms. Riding slowly along until the foremost man came up by my side, I immediately presented my pistol, which I had drawn under my oilcloth. Each of my companions did the same, dropping back to the side of the man they had selected. I ordered my man to surrender. His response, which was an immediate one, was the discharge of his pistol, which he must have had drawn under his own overcoat cape, wounding me severely through the body, Martin recalled. I fired almost simultaneously, killing my adversary dead. One of the other men surrendered without resistance. The other sprang from his horse and under cover of the woods on the night, rode away and escaped. I succeeded in avoiding capture with a great deal of difficulty owing to my wounded condition and proximity to the enemy. The Confederates captured one prisoner who shared that they had actually shot John Rodgers Meigs of Sheridan's staff. Now, Martin's own wound from the affair was so severe that he did not return to service for 3 to 4 months. And from the collateral accounts of the incident, it appears as though both Martin and Shaver believed they fired the fatal shots. The exact responsibility is difficult to discern, given the post-war accounts of the incident. While Martin's affidavit about the affair is the closest to the actual death and is highly detailed, Shaver claimed after the war that it was actually he who fired the fatal shots. And his explanation convinced his own family, some of the Union veterans that were there, and many ex-Confederates after the war at reunions. And given the locations of John Rodgers' wounds, this would mean that Shaver fired 2 pistol shots in rapid succession that both hit Meigs' body. And Shaver's claim rested on the specific detail that he had taken the wounded Martin's pistol and belt back to camp after Meigs' death and inspected the weapon. The pistol and belt had been placed on the back of Meigs' own captured white-faced horse. And Shaver claimed that Martin's pistol must have misfired when they both aimed at Meigs, since all of the loads remained in Martin's pistol, but that afterwards the percussion caps had all burst. He had never fired anything. He thought that he had, but he hadn't. If Shaver's account is accurate, then it was he, not Martin, who fired the fatal volleys. Now, the third Confederate, F.M. Campbell, had fired at the orderlies with Meigs. Benjamin Franklin Shaver believed that Martin did not even know this information about his own pistol until 1877. Regardless, Confederate eyewitness accounts again demonstrate the confusion at the base of this incident. After the war, Montgomery Meigs received an account of the night from one of the Union orderlies. He determined that the man had seen little and fled almost upon the first shots. The level of detail in the Confederate accounts from both George W. Martin and Benjamin Franklin Shaver, however, leave little doubt about the circumstances. Confederates had attempted to capture Meigs' party, and Meigs was killed in the attempt. Sheridan's account was clearly a stilted defense of his own somewhat rash action after receiving a false report that bushwhackers had attacked Meigs' party. It was understandable that the escaped soldier believed the men might have been bushwhackers, but they clearly were not, only cavalry scouts from a regular regiment on patrol. Sheridan's actions fit really within his overall strategic goal of crippling the Valley's economic and agricultural support for the Confederacy, punishing irregulars and their supporters. It's almost impossible to know if Montgomery Meigs ever made a final determination in his own mind about the exact events of his own son's death, but after receiving this account from the Union orderly, he appears to have been satisfied with his own search for the truth. I don't know if he ever really made peace with this, though, ever. The entire incident of mistaken guerrilla identity demonstrates a central conundrum for both the Union and the Confederate forces as they waged an increasingly deadly civil war in which political divisions and the use of ambush, deception, and hit-and-run tactics became common across every seceding state. Identifying the regular enlisted men versus the self-directed bushwhacker was not always possible in the often chaotic and happenstance conditions of the field. And emotion frequently drove the punitive responses of both Union and Confederate commanders as a result. Meigs was clearly not killed by bushwhackers. It was not a murder either. But the fear of Mosby's partisan rangers, John Hans McNeil, and self-constituted bushwhackers in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia created conditions where some Union soldiers saw a guerrilla around every tree and bush. In the end, Montgomery Meigs leads when he studied the moment, the incident, the night of the wounding, circled somewhat frustratingly back to the regular Confederate scouts who actually killed his son. Eventually, a clearer picture of the night would emerge when Confederate accounts of the incident became available after the war. But during the war, it remained a question mark in his mind. In the interim, the Meigs family became distraught, and they began a memorialization process that used their son's remains as a weapon against the Confederacy. Even after the surrender of its regular armies in 1865, an article in the National Republican from 1868 described the monument that the Meigs family placed over John's initial burial site in Georgetown, the Georgetown neighborhood of D.C. Upon an oblong variegated marble block in the portion of the cemetery near Rock Creek Park is a bronze figure recumbent and in uniform of Lieutenant John Rodgers Meigs, son of Major General Montgomery Meigs, who was killed by guerrillas while in the service as engineer, Army of the Shenandoah. More than a decade later, his father, as quartermaster general, who was principally responsible for the effort to turn Arlington Plantation into a cemetery for the Union War dead, had the body of his son moved, reinterred, in what is now Section 1 of Arlington National Cemetery on November 23, 1880. This followed the internment of his own wife, Louisa, in that section in 1879. The cenotaph of John Rodgers Meigs, sculpted by T. Fisk Mills, is shocking. This is sculpted in 1865, and it's a startling reminder of the human cost of the American Civil War. Sitting upon a green marble base, the cenotaph depicts Meigs' body as it was found in the road by Union troops following his ill-fated reconnaissance mission. In the cenotaph, Meigs is accoutred in full Union Army uniform, tied around his neck, a new cape, one of his father's final gifts to him, which came during a visit to West Point. I found this in his diary. He writes, he said, "Dad came to West Point to see me. He brought me a brand new cape from Philadelphia." A moment described in one of John's journals. His sword and sword belt still tightly affixed, the Union officer's ubiquitous eagle belt plate shining in the light. His binocular case slung over his body. Meigs' pistol, a Cold Army Model 1863, lay in the mud beside his body, dropped at his death. His boots looked freshly polished. His hair tousled, boyish. Perhaps most striking is the size of the monument. The cenotaph is not a full-scale model. John Rodgers Meigs, a grown man of 22 years at the time of his death, is recreated in the size of a small boy, which is no doubt how his parents always saw him. Etched into the bronze are the imprints of horse hooves representing the act of Confederates on horseback driving the body into the muddy Shenandoah Valley Road where he died. Around the base of the bronze is this text: Lieutenant John Rodgers Meigs, U.S. Engineers, Chief Engineer of the Army of the Shenandoah, born 9th February 1842, killed 3rd October 1864. Next to John Rodgers Meigs' burial site is the much larger grave marker of his parents, Montgomery Cunningham Meigs and Louisa Rodgers Meigs. Now, the story keeps going on. In the John Rodgers Meigs grave marker, one can see the expression of sorrow for two parents who lost their promising firstborn son in a war that Montgomery Meigs blamed, at least in large part, on Robert E. Lee, his former U.S. Army commander before the American Civil War. You see, Montgomery Meigs was from Savannah, Georgia. A former commander of Montgomery Meigs in the antebellum U.S. Army, Lee was who Meigs blamed for the war. Meigs, a Georgian by birth, believed the Lee family were criminals. They were traitors to the United States, and Lee, one of the most important commanders of the rebellion. The exhumation and placement of John Rodgers Meigs was also a continuation of his father's earlier political statement of having the unknown dead of First Bull Run reburied in a large pit. The unknown dead of First Bull Run reburied in a large pit in the former Lee Rose Garden at Arlington. It is, along with many many other Union Civil War grave markers placed within yards of Arlington House, a political statement, a powerful form of vengeance and retaliation toward Lee and his family, a permanent reminder of their guilt and punishment for their part in America's most costly war. The act of turning Arlington into a cemetery stripped the Lee family of its tangible family home place and part of its long history and attachment to the nation. It symbolically forced them to atone for their leadership role in the rebellion that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths by forcing them to own those deaths, by turning up the soil at Arlington with the loyal Union dead. Clearly, men like Sheridan, John Rodgers Meigs Superior, as well as a long list of Union officers, including Dan Sickles, David Dixon Porter, William S. Rosecrans, Abner Doubleday, George Crook, John Gibbon, Nelson Miles, had their own graves placed there as a final act of guarding the Union. The large number of soldiers' graves on the property ensured that Arlington would never be fully restored to the Lee family as a working plantation. Even after a U.S. Supreme Court decision returned the property to the Lee family in 1882. You see, there's a long tortured history to that as well. The Congress of the United States wouldn't give Arlington back to the Lees, though they filed for it, so they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And eventually the Supreme Court gave the property back to the Lee family, but it had already been created into a cemetery. After extensive negotiations, Lee's son, Custis, subsequently sold the property back to the U.S. government for $150,000 in 1883, ending the story. But Robert E. Lee's wife makes her final trip. Lee never went back, but his wife went back in a carriage, and she never got out of the carriage whenever she pulled up to the house. She saw what had been done to the property, and she just had them take her away. She dies very shortly thereafter. But Custis keeps pushing to get the property back. Now, in the end, John Rodgers Meigs' story, the story behind his grave marker, is one of punitive warfare on several levels. A punishment of Robert E. Lee for his role in leading a secessionist rebellion, but also a punishment of the Confederates who killed John Rodgers Meigs by a father powerfully positioned to make Confederate leaders feel his pain as personally as he possibly could. Retaliation for guerrilla violence and sudden unexpected death in the field at the hands of regular soldiers, mistakenly identified as bushwhackers. In microcosm, Meigs' death offers a mixture of both personal and national atonement and retribution for how violent the Army, the war, had become for Confederates who sought independence through the use of irregular warfare, and Union soldiers who sought the restoration of the Union through a more retributive destruction. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Don't be shy. Yes, sir.
You ever get any static for calling it the Civil War?
Not too much anymore. Yeah. I mean, I used to when I first started out, when I was very young. I was 19 or 20, and I'd kind of do the roundtable circuit, and I would go out and I would speak. Every once in a while I would. And I was in Ohio, so not too much even in Virginia. But more interestingly, probably the funniest thing was when I started out with the Park Service. I was very, very young, and when I first started out in uniform, I would often get retired Foreign Service workers or Defense Department guys that would come down on the weekend, and they would have a lot of fun with me. I said, let's see how much we can challenge this young guy and see what he knows. And it was always fun to see guys who had been studying the war for 40 years come and try to pick my brain about it and see what I did and what I didn't know and what I couldn't remember. So usually there were a lot of those kind of gotcha moments, but not really with that so much. Yeah. Thank you. Good question. Yes, sir. Sorry, Dennis, I thought you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Monument there. How does Arlington, how does the cemetery deal with that? I've been to Arlington Cemetery a couple times. I don't remember ever having seen it today.
It's easy to walk right by. You're absolutely right.
They don't give it any prominence in place.
Yeah, it's about 40 yards away from where the Bull Run dead are, and there's a much larger monument to the unknown first Bull Run dead And that's even a little closer to the house. This is still section 1, it's just a little farther off. If you wander around the house kind of on the front of the hill as you look out toward L'Enfant Plaza and toward the rest of the Capitol, you'll actually see all the prominent Union Army general graves. That's where Phil Sheridan is, that's where Crook is, and Sickles and John Gibbon. Interestingly enough, Joe Wheeler, the Confederate general, is also there. But after the war, he rejoined the U.S. Army and fought during the Spanish-Cuban-Philippine conflict, and he's buried there as well. So that's all within a very short walking distance of this, but it's so small. I mean, it's really about the size of a 6 or 7-year-old little boy. You can walk right by it and you never even see it. But it was moved. Originally, it was in Rock Creek Park at the Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown. And I tried to get information from that cemetery. I actually wrote that cemetery, specifically the rector of the cemetery, to find out more, and they really don't have anything in terms of new material on the original burial before the exhumation. Yeah.
Going back to the next picture for 1 second.
The
Guy sitting under the tree.
this one here?
Yes. What is he doing?
That's a good question. He looks like he's doing yoga, right? Yeah. Yeah, I can't say I've ever noticed him. It's a good question. I was always asking the question, why are these people standing over here? You know, but that's a good question. I don't know. Maybe he's just relaxing. You know, it's a good question. Yeah. He is. Yeah, I believe he is in uniform. The uniforms look fairly similar. This is a '64 image where they're still guarding the house, actually. The internments start mid-war because they run out of land in Alexandria, Virginia, and so they start bringing new internments to Arlington because it's open space, essentially. And they had seized Arlington property early on in the conflict in 1862, and so they start using it as overflow burial space from the cemeteries in Alexandria. That's kind of how this slow, tortured process of Arlington National Cemetery beginning happens. And then Meigs, because he's quartermaster general of the Union Army, he has more than just logistical power over buying, he also has control of the national cemetery system and the burials. A quartermaster general did that in the mid-19th century. So that's why he's in charge of this national cemetery system in the beginning at Arlington. He's trying to figure out what to do with the bodies, and this is how he ends up dealing with it. Rich?
Barton, were there any other cases like this where a lot of attention was given after the war to determine whether someone was killed by regular or irregular forces? And were there legal ramifications?
There are a handful. There are a handful of war crimes cases. The most notable does not involve irregular warfare. It involves Andersonville Prison, and that's Henry Wurz, who is a Swiss-born officer in the Confederate Army who becomes the commander of Andersonville Prison. Most people believe he's the only person executed for war crimes at the end of the American Civil War because of what happened at Andersonville and the tens of thousands of deaths and the squalor and how Union prisoners were treated there. That's not actually true. There were a couple of others. One of them is very prominent, and it was a guerrilla warfare story, and that's Champion Ferguson. Champion Ferguson was a Tennessee mountain guerrilla who claimed to have killed more than 40 people during the course of the war himself. His wife and his family were assaulted during the middle of the war, and it really sent Ferguson off on a one-man vendetta against the Union Army. At the end of the war, the Union Army captures Ferguson and they put him under heavy guard. There's a very famous photo of this where he's surrounded by about 15 different Union soldiers that are all about 5'6", and Ferguson was at about, he towers over them at over 6 foot, and they're really scared of this guy. And what was said about Ferguson was that he didn't have politics, he just had grudges. All right? And so he goes on to kill and kill and kill, and he actually was tried for war crimes as well and eventually executed for all those deaths. So that's one case, but it's not quite the investigation that went in, and I think this has to do with the prominence of Montgomery, of his father, and his ability. He actually went to the trouble of hiring his own private investigator and an agent to investigate his son's death after the war. So, yeah, it's a really tragic story in many ways. He never really let go of this. John?
To bring Ulysses Grant into this, I recall reading in August of '64,
Grant tells Sheridan that if you catch any more of Mosby's raiders, shoot them without court-martial.
Yeah,
So I'm wondering if there's this new sort of anti-guerrilla policy that's being implemented in the Shenandoah campaign.
Yeah, it goes, you're right, it goes beyond Francis Lieber's code, certainly, of 63, which is a much more restrained, right, Lincoln's code, which everyone sort of lays it with Lincoln's foot and sort of gives him credit for it because it comes out during his administration. It's actually written by, as you know, a German-born scholar, Francis Lieber, who's arguably the very first political scientist and very first academic historian in the United States. He practices at Columbia. And he writes this long code and formulates a definitional structure for irregular soldiers and a set of legal practices for what should happen in the field. But by 64, things are really becoming tit for tat in terms of retaliation. And Grant is frustrated. Interestingly enough, John Singleton Mosby becomes a high-value target for Grant's army after the war, or excuse me, late in the war. But he ends up as part of Grant's administration when Grant is president. He ends up as U.S. consul to Hong Kong for a brief period. And then he has a legal career after the war. So he goes on, he never surrenders, he just disbands his unit. He's never tried. He's covered by the Appomattox terms. So that's the dispensation there. But I think, John, maybe it's even more jarring that it comes from the Secretary of War as well. Right? I mean, Stanton is actually saying by any means necessary, and you don't even need to make a report. Right? So that's, I mean, in some ways, that's even more over the top than what Grant had said. So I mean, I found that one really jarring when I found it, the Stanton comment on it. Go ahead, sir.
I'm all class of 54, and I heard a pretty interesting story to me today, and I wonder if it has any factual part to it.
Sure.
And the story goes that, let's see, they used in the war troops to bring up the numbers. They used VMI cadets, and that was at one point. And then later, the cadets at another thing, they were just there to look like we had more numbers than we did. So then they used the cadets for real and brought them out there. The cadets saying, we want to fight. And they did fight and did well. And then Sherman was terribly upset by all of this. And he picked on Lexington and Washington Lee to come and burn VMI and burn down Washington Lee. And I went, you can stop any rumors I might spread telling me if there's any truth in any of that.
One of the major targets, actually it's interesting, I mean, this story sort of goes on. One of the major targets in Lexington was actually John Letcher's house. Letcher lives here, and he's the governor of Virginia, and he had actually called for a popular resistance using guerrilla warfare in the valley whenever Jubal Early's forces are driven out of the valley, and there's really no organized Confederate resistance left to defend the breadbasket of Virginia. And so they go after Letcher's house as well. I mean, it's an interesting story in that, the VMI cadets are not the only young people who are part of the war at the end fighting. Down in North Carolina, they are recruiting what they call the North Carolina Junior and Senior Reserves. And at the Battle of Bentonville, they actually pull these kids and old men together into a unit and put them out in the line, and they're fighting in the final days of the war to try to defend the state of North Carolina. So there's a similar kind of pattern there. VMI obviously is targeted at the end of the war because of its, not only did it send the cadets to fight at Newmarket in the Valley in '64, but it also had been a training ground. Obviously it's a target because of Jackson as well and his prominence before the war and during the war. But by that point, Lexington had really become the beginning of what it's going to become after the war, which is the growth of becoming a symbol of the Confederacy itself. a kind of last resting place for the Confederacy and its memory. So that's a kind of tangled story we don't need to really get into today because it would take us a long time to unpack it. But it's a long one, and it's really worth investigating. So thank you for bringing that up because it reminded me of that.
To continue with that story,
yes, sir.
Whether it was Judge Brokenbraw or somebody convinced Sheridan not to burn Washington Hall because it bore Washington's name, and that Sheridan's troops went to Stonewall Jackson's grave because they respected him as a general.
Yeah, Brockenbrow's an interesting figure in all of this. He was known before the war as being a little bit more of a radical in terms of pro-slavery politics, even within the Lexington community. There's a well-known incident in the 1850s where Judge Brockenbrow, who was kind of a well-known drinker, is called by George Junkin, who's the president of Washington College at the time. He's sort of called a rum sucker on the streets of Lexington, and they have a bit of a row, fisticuffs, and George Junkin doesn't back down. He's there fighting, and Junkin goes on and actually is a unionist. He's one of the leading kind of intellectual lights within the Presbyterian Church, and he is a defender of slavery, but he's a slave owner, but he's a unionist, and he's the final president before Robert E. Lee becomes president as well. So it's kind of an interesting additional story to the Brockenbrow element, but from the antebellum period. Yeah. Yes, sir. In the back there.
Am I wrong in thinking that Arlington came into Lee's management through the ownership of his wife?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Am I correct in thinking that?
Yes, you are. He manages the plant.
So why
he never owns it, but he does manage the plantation for several years in the 1850s. Not very well, but he manages it. Yes.
Right. Surely then it's an insult against the Washington family to be burying on a Washington estate.
Yeah, arguably. Lee marries into the Washington line by marrying a Custis. Now, George Washington Parke Custis, who had owned Arlington, his daughter is the one that Robert E. Lee marries. Now, George Washington Parke Custis was the adopted son, the step-grandson of George Washington. And they're very close. Robert E. Lee actually receives a pair of George Washington's dueling pistols at one point. We have them here in our collection. So there is this family connection, but actually, I think it goes even deeper than that, the connection between Lee and Washington, and it comes right down to this. Robert E. Lee's mother was a woman named Anne Hill Carter, and the Carters of Virginia are one of the first families of Virginia, one of the wealthiest families, one of the most powerful families in the state, and Anne Hill Carter was the major force in Robert E. Lee's life in terms of his education. She instilled in him a respect for Washington above all other people. Her own husband was a hero of the American Revolution, but a disaster in terms of the family's finances. And he, of course, is buried on our campus as well, Light Horse Harry Lee, a great hero of the partisan war of the American Revolution, one of the best friends of Washington, right? He's the one who calls Washington first of war, first of peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. And yet he speculates away the family's fortune, and they end up in dire straits, right? So it's his mother that inculcates that tradition of respect for Washington in Lee himself. Anne Hill Carter, actually, interesting. Douglas Southwell Freeman, the great historian, won the Pulitzer Prize a couple times for Washington and Lee biographies. He says that it's Anne Hill Carter that received the brain power in the family of the Carter line, that it ran through the women, not the men. And he speculates that she's the reason why Robert E. Lee has such a respect for Washington. Go ahead, sir.
Is very much known about the relationship between Lee and Meg's father before the war?
There's not very much. What is known is that he was Robert E. Lee was his commanding officer before the war. Lee spent a good deal of time in Savannah, actually, during his military career before the war. He was working on Fort Pulaski and a number of fortifications there. He actually almost married a girl from Savannah, one of his best friends, Jack McKay. He nearly married her down there. But it's at that period that Meigs has contact with him. Meigs isn't the only Southerner who stays loyal to the Union. You got Winfield Scott very prominently in Virginia, who's, you know, next to Washington and Andrew Jackson and a couple of other people, Winfield Scott is one of the greatest military commanders of the 19th century. And he is a Virginian who remains loyal to the Union. He's the one who offers lead command of the Union Army in 1861. So there are a handful of very prominent cases of that are worth looking at because they make different decisions and for different reasons. But Winfield Scott said, I've spent my entire life serving the United States Army. I can't walk away from it now. Yes, sir.
Do we know at all why that Leslie's illustrator Taylor went back to investigate? I mean, he must have written 1,000, certainly hundreds of scenes. What led him to go back and investigate further about that?
I think it was the prominence of Meigs and the fact that he was so close when it actually happened. He's right there at the command tent. He's covering the Army. He's making sure that regular reports are going back. I mean, there were two big illustrated weeklies at that point. There was Harper's Weekly and there was Frank Leslie's, and he's one of the correspondents. And so I think at the end of the war, he was still left with questions himself. At first, he actually buys the story and then eventually goes back and starts talking to the Confederates, and he's like, something doesn't add up here. It just doesn't quite make sense. And he's the one that actually comes down with a real concrete verdict after looking at all of the different evidence and says, you know what? I think Sheridan got it wrong at the time. I don't think this was a murder, and I don't think he was killed by bushwhackers. I actually think these guys were just out on patrol and it was an accident, and it was a very tragic one, but everybody overreacted because of the prominence of this kid, this 22-year-old John Rodgers Meigs. So I think that's why. I think it had everything to do with just the prominence of him, why he went back and investigated. Yes, sir.
Your discussion of guerrilla warfare puts in mind a wonderful book by Jay Winnick.
Oh, yeah.
1865,
yeah.
When Jefferson Davis argued that they should continue the war with guerrilla warfare, and he argued against it. Was the 1864 incident maybe the seed that planted that idea of continuing guerrilla warfare?
Well, there are a couple of moments, right? I mean, there's a very famous speech that Jefferson Davis gives in February of '65 that you're mentioning, and that speech has been interpreted a couple of different ways by historians. Winnick interprets it as a call for small guerrilla bands to continue the war. Other scholars have interpreted that particular speech as meaning something slightly different, meaning that Robert E. Lee should go about a more mobile war with the Army of Northern Virginia whenever he's freed from defending Richmond, which had been kind of the prison for the Army of Northern Virginia. They had to defend the capital, and if they were freed from defending the capital, they might be able to wage a more mobile war. So that's another way of interpreting that same speech that Davis gave. There are a number of other moments where people proposed actually to Robert E. Lee a continued irregular war, and he basically uses a more or less an age argument, somewhat generational argument. He says, I'm an old man. If you young men want to go off and try to do this, I have no other choice but to go, and the honorable thing is for me to go and surrender the Army to General Grant. So in some ways, Robert E. Lee deserves an enormous amount of credit of tamping down the violence at the end of the war by that very decision, because there were certainly younger officers who wanted to continue the war by disbanding and going off and waging a continued conflict immediately in April of '65. Edward Porter Alexander, his memoir has an account of this. If you, Fighting for the Confederacy is the name of it, if you ever want to read it. Yes, sir.
Would the Union generals have known or cared that the burnt district may not have been Southern sympathizers?
This is a great question, because this maybe troubles me the most about this. Most of the people who were displaced were almost certainly Unionists. They were Mennonites, they were peaceful people, many of them were anti-slavery. And they are displaced just by happenstance that they live there. And it's going to be, in some cases, even years before some of these people come back and return to their homes and what's left of them. So, but there were many Unionists. There are Unionists sprinkled in counties all across the seceding states, some pockets here and there. And we're still unearthing a lot of their stories. And these people are primarily Unionists because some of them are pacifists. There's a strong Quaker belt in North Carolina, a similar kind of situation. And we're still trying to find a way to put their stories back into the Civil War story and make sense of them, because they've been kind of lost for a long time. Yes?
Barton, I just heard you use the word honorable.
Yeah.
So I assume there were competing sides during the Civil War that felt they were being honorable?
Yes, sir.
So I'd love to hear how you think about that.
Well, you know, people defined honor very differently in the early 19th century in the American South than we define it today. There are a lot of different ways of looking at the term and how it plays out. There's a real famous study by Bertram Wyatt Brown, which was up for the Pulitzer. It did not win in the early 1980s, and it's called Southern Honor. And it's a great book. It's probably the best single study of this particular issue. Civil War era Southerners think of themselves through the prism of that kind of honor. It's a process. It's an assessment. This is what Wyatt Brown says. It's an assessment of a person's status within the community, by the community. One makes a claim in front of the community to be honorable. And then the community assesses whether that person is wanting or whether or not they are honorable. And now it comes with all of the different kind of code that you see, the code duello and the violence and its role with slavery and oppression. But in its essence, it's a claim in front of a community and the community's assessment of that claim. Okay? And it played out over and over and over again as a practice. I mean, you have Andrew Jackson. I posted this story on my Facebook page a couple of days ago of how many duels did Andrew Jackson actually get into across his life? Was it hundreds? No, it was actually probably 2.5 or something like that. Andrew Jackson, how did he see his honor? He saw it in a much more masculine, violent way where he had to act it out in front of people. He didn't get to the presidency through his intellect. He got there with his fists, right? He got there through his perseverance physically, right? So I would say there have been many different versions of honor, and where you vest that. And, you know, people ask me, do you think Robert E. Lee was honorable? I said, oh yeah, absolutely, I think Robert E. Lee was honorable. Who do you think took care of his mother whenever she was sick at the end of his life? At the end of her life, it was Robert E. Lee that went back and took care of his mother. Right? I mean, there are lots of different ways you can unpack that, right? I mean, does he honor his terms of enlistment to the United States Army? For most of his career, yes, he does. And then he resigns them, right? He doesn't resign his citizenship, right? But his enlistment in the Army. So we have to continue to lay it out accurately, honestly, and say yes and no, right? There's a clear answer there. It's both, right? It depends on how you're asking the question, right? He didn't drink, right? Some people might define it that way, right? Did he support the Confederacy, which sought a nation state rooted in the idea that we would have slavery perpetually in this country? Absolutely. He was one of the most successful generals the Confederacy had. But there's another way of looking at it. Was he one of the greatest military commanders in the 19th century the United States produced? Yes, absolutely. He was all of those things. It's not easy. It's not really an either or. I mean, if you want an either or, then probably I shouldn't be the person you ask. Okay?
I wasn't seeking either or.
Okay. Sorry. I'm sorry. I probably should have just given you honesty. That's my answer, right? Thanks, Dennis. Appreciate it. Anyone else? Thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here.